Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon sessions of the BPOA Spring Conference. A couple of themes, carbon, problem and opportunity, and then followed by spring crop session. First of all, I would like to introduce the carbon, problem and opportunity session. We've got a couple of excellent speakers for you this afternoon, Martin and Jon. Let me just do a quick introduction to Martin. Martin's a sustainability consultant with 25 years experience, sort of background. He comes from a plant science background with experience of sort of supply chain in horticulture. And until very recently, he was working as a head of sustainability for Flamingo Horticulture. He's going to talk to us this afternoon about the general background to carbon and in a sort of more global sense. And then Jon will then follow on with a sort of more practical talk about how that actually the implications to horticulture itself. So without further ado, let me hand over to Martin.
Thanks very much, Chris. Please let me know if you can hear me clearly and everything's going according to plan. Please don't hesitate to interrupt if that's the case.
It's all good.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to try and talk about carbon and horticultural supply chains and the opportunity we have in order to play our part in the global context. What I'll look to cover today is framing the context of carbon and the climate change and the Paris Agreement of 2015. Take a quick look at some of the challenges facing growers and due to stakeholder demands, customer demands. I'll cover a little bit of the Oxford principles for net zero aligned carbon offsetting. Obviously, there's so much going on in this area that it's good to try and look at some basic principles when we get involved in the world of carbon. Have a look at low carbon transition planning for businesses to try and understand how that can work in the context of growers and growing. And then touch on some of the standards coming up and have a look at the work being undertaken to try and harmonize some of the methodologies as we move forward. And then I've included a small glossary and some further information and links, which will hopefully be useful as people get grappling with carbon. As we're all aware, obviously we hear in the news quite a lot about carbon, and I've just tried to capture some snapshots to understand why on earth we're here in the news and have so much information about carbon in our businesses. Human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, with a likely range of 0.8 to 1.2. Global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees C between 2030 and 2050 if it continues at this current rate. Obviously, the Paris Agreement was brought in 2015. It's a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at the COP21 in Paris and entered into force in November 2016. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees C compared to pre-industrial levels. Meeting the Paris Agreement will require decarbonization of all aspects of the economy, and the IPCC clarified that achieving a 1.5 C goal will require approximately 50% reduction of emissions by 2030. Which is a huge amount. It equates to 23 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, leading to a net zero emissions by 2050. So we're on that journey about climate, reducing the impact of climate, and we'll now just have a look at what would happen if the current trends would continue. The global average temperatures would likely to rise to 3.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100. That doesn't sound a lot, but a temperature rise of this magnitude will push critical carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks, beyond dangerous tipping points. That's your permafrosts and your tropical forests, initiating harmful feedback loops in the climate system. These will amplify the human emission releases. Physical impacts such as fires, flooding, storms will continue to increase in frequency and intensity, leading to vast ecosystem and human impacts. From a socio-economic perspective, 5 systems are directly affected by climate change: livability and workability, food, physical assets, infrastructure, and natural capital. As noted above, achieving a 2050 net zero pathway necessary for the 1.5C goal requires deep and rapid reductions beginning now across all sectors of the economy. And it's within this context and within this framework we look as growers and horticultural producers and how we can play our part. So if you have a look at the graph on the screen now, it just shows you how close we are to the 1.5 degrees C, and obviously the chance to modify the curve, change the curve. We achieved a 1 degree rise above pre-industrial levels in 2017. So the clock is really ticking. Obviously, within our industry, within horticulture, we get a lot of customer and stakeholder demand through the media, and obviously that also has an impact on our business and the chance for us to play our part. We're constantly looking at headlines, and I'm sure that all of the people attending today are facing and seeing the same headlines in the media. So there's obviously an opportunity in this sense for horticulture to make sure that the plants and the products that are sold are environmentally friendly. And in this sense, undertaking and working on carbon will be a positive thing for business. So having discussed the framework and the opportunity, we now sort of trying to understand, given the complexity of the subject, opportunities to simplify it. And the Oxford University have developed a net zero aligned carbon offsetting principle document, which tries to underline for businesses and help to clarify and help society to develop a net zero society. They've developed a set of principles which can apply to businesses and other stakeholders in order to start this journey of carbon reductions. Principle 1 is to cut emissions, use high quality offsets, and regularly revise offsetting strategy as best practices. So yes, the first step is obviously to cut and remove unnecessary emissions. The principle 2 is to shift to carbon removal offsetting. That is removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Those are undertakings which actually physically remove carbon, such as forestry, rather than things like renewables or low energy cook stoves in the tropics. Principle 3 is to shift on to long-term storage. That storage where you've got direct atmosphere capture and storage, or bioenergy capture and storage. So those are the long-term goals, is to make sure that we take out the carbon for the long term. But initially, the focus and short-term carbon removal is just as important as we move towards 2050. And principle 4 is to support the development of a net zero aligned offsetting by working together as industries and other stakeholders. Industry groups like horticulture would be well advised to try and work together as an industry to align, to make sure that the industries are aligned and along the journey for everybody following along. If we have a look at the basic taxonomy of carbon credits, which I touched on the previous slide, we've got emission reductions and carbon removals, and obviously, as indicated within the principles, the Oxford principles, carbon removal is preferred. We look on the left-hand side of that that diagram, we look at renewable energies, biorenewables, low energy cook stoves, and on the right hand side we look at direct atmosphere carbon capture and bioenergy capture and storage and mineralization. So there's a whole raft of opportunities within carbon to play the part along that journey. If we now look at how businesses can transition to low carbon, we obviously have got different methods and different opportunities across that story. We can avoid and compensate at the bottom. There's some long-term strategies and short-term strategies as well, which are equally valuable around businesses looking to reduce their carbon footprint. If I have a look at the carbon landscape and trying to get the language involved within the carbon story, we obviously look at the center of that diagram, the reporting company, within our scope 1, our direct emissions as a business. And then obviously we scope 2, upstream, where our purchased electricity and our cooling results in scope 2. We've also got upstream scope 3 activities relating to activities like business travel and all other aspects of commerce, which are upstream activities. And then obviously, as the products we produce are sold and sold to customers, we continue that journey through to the end of the product life. And that's the sort of scope 1s, scope 2 and scope 3 relating to carbon. From my perspective, I like really simple metrics and ideas, and obviously in a quick summary, measure, reduce, offset is quite a good mnemonic in this area to try and get it on top of the challenges that we face. This is obviously measure, know your climate impact, reduce, make efforts to reduce impacts. So obviously those are the first steps along the journey, and then for unavoidable carbon emissions, offsets are the way forward. Another way of looking at this is eliminate this diagram here from the Institute of Environmental Management, looking at your scope 1 and your scope 2 as a pie chart, and obviously eliminate, reduce, substitute and compensate is the same message. But all this information is sort of guiding us along the steps that we need to take along the carbon journey. I just wanted to, look at some good news. Some producers have already started the journey. I was just looking in the media to try and get some headlines for this conference, and obviously the one I came across fairly recently was a grower in Kenya. Tambuzi has achieved carbon neutral gold standard, and the UN Climate Now initiative. So they've measured their carbon footprint. They've reduced it where they can, and then taken the steps to offset it, and then in that sense have already made that journey to carbon neutrality. Now, I just wanted to take a few minutes to have a look at some of the standards, and obviously it's quite a minefield, and trying to clarify some of the different standards out there. The top three standards are very commonly applied within the UN climate goals and the carbon and the voluntary carbon markets. It's the greenhouse gas protocols, the PAS 2060 carbon neutrality standard, and the ISO 1464 greenhouse accounting and verification standards. They're all they're all looking at the same things, but have got slightly different slants on it. And then within the horticultural industry, we've got the EU product environmental footprint category rules, which have been developed with special reference to horticulture. This work is in progress and utilizes a life cycle analysis approach to encompass one unified methodology of for the horticultural footprint. Current studies for 6 representative products include apples, bananas, tomatoes, tulip bulbs, phalaenopsis orchids, and roses. The sector is now working towards a FloriPEF, which will be signed off by the EU formally. Completion of this work will take place in 2022. So with the multitude of standards out there, it's having a look at what the representative products will be for the FloriPEF, for the plant producers. The representative products have chosen to be phalaenopsis orchids, dracaenas, and lavender in different growing media. And this is the work that the technical committee will take through using a life cycle analysis. It's quite complicated. There are over 16 impact categories. It's not worth reading all the different categories, but it takes into account things like climate change, eutrophication, all aspects of a life cycle of a plant. And they've defined it now for the key impact categories for phalaenopsis cultivation. So that's heat from CHP, electricity from the grid, aluminium for greenhouses, electronics in the greenhouses. In this way, they really are looking much further than the first 3 standards we talked about, for just relating to climate change. They're looking much more at the other impacts from an environmental perspective, right through to end of life. I'll just finish off by including a few terms of technical terms, which obviously this area is rife with, and it's just something that might be quite useful as you develop your expertise in the area. And I've included also from further links for some of the information I've shared as well. So on that note, I will end the talk and wait through for any questions.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for that. That was a comprehensive coverage of the situation. One question I'd sort of like to ask is, where do you think horticultural businesses are, in your experience as a consultant, where do you think horticultural businesses typically are at the moment in responding to this?
I think you get a whole range, actually, for some businesses that have gone a long way along the ground, like, for example, that business in Kenya, and then others are just starting that journey. If I would hazard a guess, most are at the beginning, but there are some leaders. That would be my feeling so far.
How far ahead of where have the leaders got to, do you think?
Well, so some of them have achieved carbon neutrality through offsetting, so those are the very first ones that I've seen go through the process. But obviously there's a lot of growers are to the point where they understand their carbon footprints, but haven't made that final step to offsetting the unavoidable. There's a lot of work that goes on with regards to LED lights and reducing. But actually, I think the next step for the industry is around the offsetting and looking at opportunities in that space.
What scheme is best for? Just a question has just come in. What scheme do you think is the best for horticulture for auditing and monitoring?
Well, the EU Horti footprint is going to be the most comprehensive, but the other standards which are related to the UN climate are more advanced at the moment and able to be part of the voluntary carbon markets. The EU Horti footprints, which are following along in the next couple of years, will be probably the most comprehensive methodologies from which growers will be able to develop their standards in terms of carbon reductions.
Do you know if there's going to be a sort of UK version of those, or will we be just sort of trying to sort of piggyback on that from the outside?
Yeah, no, the rules the footprint itself will determine the rules, and from that you can develop as many different standards around the world. So the rules will be defined, and obviously different countries will approach them, will develop the standards accordingly. So, for example, one might expect standard setting organizations like, I just take an example, LeafMark, or one of the might actually develop a standard using those category rules, so that growers could undertake footprinting on those lines.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for your contribution. And obviously, just to remind people that if you've got any questions for Martin, we will be available in the sessions at the end of the day.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everybody. Bye for now.
And I'd now like to welcome Jon Swain. Jon's Technical Director of NFU Energy. He's a mechanical engineer by training with an agricultural background, and has worked for NFU Energy, which was FEC, of course, for over 25 years. I always consider Jon to be a sort of go-to source for information on energy, greenhouse climate, especially humidity, which is one of his specialities, and humidity control. And of course, he's responsible for the very useful and successful GrowSafe program for AHDB. So Jon will now explore in a bit more detail how some of the practical elements of carbon reduction and carbon neutrality in horticulture. If I can hand you over to Jon.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you again. I really quite enjoy the conference season. It'll be sort of back end of a year and beginning of the next one. It gives us all a chance to reflect on where we are and what's happened over the previous 12 months. Just before I get started, just a little note about GrowSave. Yes, the GrowSave program, as Chris mentioned there, continues, and it exists through the AHDB website as a place for you to go and find out about what we're doing currently and the information that we present. Unfortunately, due to the circumstances of the last 12 months, we haven't got around as many training courses or in-person events as we would have normally done. And so most of our sort of communication has been online or via forums such as this, and through the press and through the written word. But all that exists through GrowSafe Horticulture, and just a reminder there to go to that site should you want to find out about any of this, or indeed give us a call or drop us an email. Contact details will be at the end. As I said, it gives us the chance to reflect on where we are and what's happened over the past 12 months. And what I would say over the last 12 months, I mentioned in last year's conference about net zero, sort of piggybacking on an energy market update. And since then, I wouldn't say there's been a huge amount of action as such on the net zero journey, except there's been a lot of talk. And energy has barely been out of the news. Carbon emissions reductions have barely been out of the news. As we head towards COP26, which was delayed and is now being sort of rehashed for later in the year, Britain and the UK are trying to get its house in order in terms of where we are going on this net zero journey, and making sure, specifically in the energy landscape, that we're doing the right things. And that we're sort of building those foundations for achieving net zero. Net zero itself, clearly has become quite a buzzword over the last 12 months, and it's useful just to remind ourselves, what does that mean? Effectively, it means we need to balance out what we emit in carbon with what we take up in carbon terms. So we're talking about reducing our carbon emissions to effectively zero by making sure that what we emit is balanced by what we sequester or offset or put somewhere else. And lots of people have made a commitment, over the last sort of 12, 24 months into net zero. Yeah, clearly the NFU has a commitment to achieve net zero in agriculture by 2040, 10 years earlier than the UK's commitment for 2050. Retailers are similarly providing some form of commitments to their consumers, to their customers. And some people are on some sort of goal scoring, point scoring exercise and just sort of bringing this net zero time of 2050 down further and further still. I heard Morrison's might even be thinking of 2030. B&Q want to make sure that they're got some form of net zero commitment in their electricity terms by 2030, etc., etc., etc. So there seems to be a move to, can we get to net zero even quicker than maybe the UK or the government's aspiration? And is that some form of marketing or selling point, or something that we should be considering? But clearly, we shouldn't be overly ambitious. It's still a tough target. We all have to play our part in that. And getting there by 2050 is going to be, as the UK is going to be tough, let alone getting to agricultural net zero by 2040. So what is the scale of the problem? So the NFU have sort of categorized the problem, and it's the orangey ready graph bar on the left-hand side that you need to be looking at in terms of the size of the problem. The emissions in carbon terms are predominantly made up of methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide emissions as direct emissions to air. And on that basis, carbon dioxide, which is actually the bit we can do most about in horticulture, we don't have such the land area to worry about the nitrous oxide, or the livestock that worries about the methane side of things as much. That's a smaller part of the problem. But ironically, it's one of the parts of the problems that we could do something about relatively quickly through some concentration on energy efficiencies, renewable energy, reducing our inputs, making sure that we buy inputs that are less carbon, and make sure that we pass on less carbon to our consumers. So it's an area we can start to do something about. And that's really, I guess, one of my messages today. Taking the first steps is to look at a cold hard look at what you do and say, where can I make the biggest difference, or where can I make some difference right now? And if I can make some difference right now, it's better than making a really, really big difference maybe in 10 years' time. And that gives us the confidence to move forward in that journey. And as I said, yeah, what can we influence in horticulture? It's our inputs, it's our energy consumption, it's our productivity. And excuse me, I'm in one of these places where we have energy efficiency lights and they turn off when they think that you're not moving. So I do apologise for that. Hopefully that won't happen again in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. In terms of taking that footstep or that journey towards net zero, understanding, I think Martin put this right, understanding what you're emitting by measurement, then being more efficient, reducing your inputs, and finally sequestering and looking for alternative resources. Yeah, that is the pathway that we should all be on, rather than just jumping to maybe sequestering or jumping to alternative resources. We actually need to get a good handle on this side of things. And that's our first step. Then we will have the confidence to make those resource efficiencies that help us towards that net zero journey, make that size of the balance less. In terms of quantifying your emissions, yeah, we go back into the sort of the jargon of carbon footprinting, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and Martin mentioned this, you know, what fits into each of those scopes. And really, when we're talking about those bits that we can make a big direct difference, we're talking about scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3 is a real difficult thing to get your head around and to start to measure, because quite often you don't have the control or enough information to work out what the impacts of those scope 3 emissions are, or even what the size of them are, once you lose control in your chain of custody. So generally, when people talk about making a carbon footprint, they get really scopes 1 and 2 quite well, and then start to set some boundaries around scope 3. And here we get even more jargon: cradle to gate, cradle to grave. You know, so what are we accounting for? Can we set some boundaries that say, actually, once it leaves my premises and goes out somewhere else, I send it out with some embodied carbon associated with it, and someone else can then take that forward and do something about it? Or am I going to be quantifying its emissions all the way through the rest of its life, in which case that's cradle to grave rather than cradle to grade? From that point of view, it's useful to try and set those boundaries, not necessarily because it's the right boundary to set, because if you don't start setting some boundaries, if you don't start doing the measurements, if you don't start quantifying these things, then you can get paralyzed by the lack of information and the lack of data, and you don't make any steps further forward at all. At this point, it might be useful just to work out, or just to try and visualize, what is a ton of carbon dioxide, because ultimately that's really the output. What is your carbon footprint? It is a measure of how many tons of carbon dioxide that you are emitting at any point in time, or for any product, or for any year, or for any period of time that you're considering your carbon footprint over. So yes, it's that should say 4 megawatts of lighting for an hour. I don't know why it says 1 megawatt of lighting. However, 4,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, a 6 meg gas boiler on for nearly an hour, 700 miles driven in HGV, a leak of refrigerant, or application of ammonium nitrate. Just trying to think what equals to a ton of carbon dioxide in various different ways that carbon dioxide is emitted. As I said, scope 3 is quite a complicated area to think about, and you can see this through all of these. I'm not going to dwell on all of these in any detail, other than to say this is the sorts of things that you must consider if you're going to include your scope 3, and therefore draw your boundaries appropriately as to where you want to quantify your carbon footprint. And so yes, think about these when you're determining, I'm going to go as far as here or as far as there. Handily, and there was a question about what scheme is best for horticulture, and Martin talked about different quantification systems. There are carbon footprint tools out there. I would say that none of these are perfect. Most of them have major flaws, especially for protected horticulture. However, what I would say, a bit like if you don't measure anything, then you never get anywhere. Sometimes you've just got to pick what is the least worst, maybe the friendliest to use, maybe the one that your agronomist or your business consultant uses, but use one of them and try to quantify your carbon footprint using it. So long as you stick to that measure and you put your inputs in year on year, or product by product or project by project in the same way, in the same format, then at least you can see the trajectory of how you are impacting your carbon footprint, whether it's going up or whether it's going down. And as I said, my message here is do something, get something started. It might not be the right way, it might not be the right tool in the long term, but at least has given something that you can tangibly say, I know I was here at point A and I'm going to go to point B by making these actions, and that is a benefit, that is an improvement or a reduction in my carbon emissions. The 3 major ones that the NFU are talking about, the Cool Farm tool, which I think is probably the most likely one to use for protected horticulture. I know a lot of the supermarkets and B&Q and the like to use that. AgriCalc is one used by the Scottish Agricultural College, and the Farm Carbon Toolkit was developed by a dairy farmer in the Cotswolds area, and sort of taken on a life of its own in a way, and is quite well suited to livestock farming. So I would imagine that either Cool Farm Tool or AgriCalc are the two that you might want to start using. In terms of carbon footprint reducing, there are some good news here, by the way, and one of them is that where electricity is involved, the carbon footprint of electricity coming from the grid has reduced dramatically over the last 20 years or so, or even 30 years. But if you look at this period specifically here, we've seen dramatic drops in the carbon footprint of grid electricity. Mostly that's from stopping coal, but latterly over the last 3 or 4 years, it's because of the predominance of renewable energy in the grid. And this year, as I said, has been a really interesting year in terms of energy, and not least because we've had some days where renewable energy has caused this 200 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour to reduce to 18 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour on a half-hour basis. So really big impacts on reducing the grid emissions or grid electricity emissions. And of course, if we're using electricity, that is reducing our carbon footprint, and we've not had to do anything about it. Particularly ourselves, it's happened by default from the grid. That trajectory is set to continue. National Grid provide renewable electricity future energy scenarios, And they think that, by 2050, 76% of our electricity is going to come from some form of renewables. I'd be surprised if that wasn't more, actually. We still need some form of inertial mass in the system to make sure that we balance out the unpredictability of some of these generations. But yes, a very, very high proportion of our energy is going to come from renewables, and therefore that carbon emissions factor associated with electricity is going to drop further still. Less good news in heating. Really, we burn fossil fuels for heating mostly, and they have carbon in them, and it's very difficult to reduce that carbon. In terms of natural gas into the grid, that's where we can probably have the biggest impact by putting green gas into the grid or hydrogen into the grid, and that will reduce the embodied emissions of natural gas. In terms of decarbonising heat in a massive way and making a big impact, it's probably not going to be hinged around combustion. It's more likely to be using electrified heating systems such as heat pumps or other forms of turning electricity into heat. The hydrogen thing's really interesting. There's a lot of talk about that again at the moment. That's probably a few years away. Probably even towards the end of my career, I should imagine, by the time that is starting to get any sort of toehold as a large decarbonisation of heat action. As I say, I think some of the immediate impacts is around heat pumps for decarbonising heat in your greenhouses. Clearly, in ornamentals, you have an advantage over the edible sector in that you don't need the combustion for the CO2 enrichment in much the same way as tomatoes or cucumbers do, which is quite good, because if we decarbonise the gas grid by putting biomethane into it, then we reduce the carbon. If we put hydrogen into it, then we reduce the carbon. So the carbon dioxide for enrichment comes down conversely. However, just a few numbers on heat pumps as a decarbonising of heat tool. So if we burn a kilowatt hour of gas from the network, then we're emitting 211 grams of CO2 to 238, allowing for boiler efficiency. If we do the similar thing through a heat pump, then we are getting sort of 40 grams of CO2 for that unit of heat, instead of 200. So a considerable reduction. Hence why the government are very keen on heat pumps as it stands at the moment. Yes, they need electricity to drive them. Yes, not all sites are suitable. They don't all have a suitable heat source, but there are some big carbon emissions reductions to be had by using heat pumps. And just to think laterally about heat sources, it's not just the ground or groundwater. This is a very large greenhouse that's going up in East Anglia at the moment, and that's using waste heat coming from the sewage treatment works. And so there's all sorts of areas where there is low-grade heat available that could actually be used to be boosted and heat our greenhouses. In the current situation that we're in, there's a lot of talk about what we call the green recovery, and packages of funding being announced regularly to push forward the agenda for renewable energy and decarbonisation around trying to kickstart some of these industries that will improve our economic situation, having gone through the year that we've just had. One of the things that the government are quite interested in and keen on, carbon capture and storage technologies, and Martin alluded to this about taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And this isn't pie in the sky stuff at all. There are people actively sucking air through big fans and taking the CO2 out of it. People are doing that as it stands, called direct air capture, DAC. And Drax Power Station are doing some form of carbon removal out of their flue gases as well. So these are here and now being done, sometimes at an industrial scale, sometimes at a smaller trial-based scale. But these are the sorts of technologies the government's very keen to support and could make a big difference in sort of addressing some of that balance where we can't avoid emitting carbon and we have to take it out of the atmosphere to redress that balance. Just before we go, it is worth having a bit of an update on energy terms. Lots of action in terms of incentivized schemes coming to an end and not very much to replace them. Here's some budget news. This actually happened. Sorry about this light yet again. These are things that actually happened pre-lockdown. This is the trajectory the government was on: increasing climate change levies, so disincentivizing fossil fuel uses, putting in a green gas levy to pay for biomethane into the grid. Applying a carbon price, that's a really interesting one. If that starts to be applied to gas, then it'll start to make gas quite expensive, as well as some small incentive news around extending the RHI and possible tariff guarantees for that, and the Green Gas Support Scheme itself. This renewable heats grant thing is worth just mentioning, but it's unlikely to be interesting too much in horticulture because it's a very low scale in terms of the amount of money that's available in that. But we're already on the path of heading towards disincentivizing fossil fuels and pushing renewable fuels higher up the agenda. So I don't think this is coming out of COVID-19 or the economic situation that we're in. This is the path that we were already on and maintained to this day. Just moving further on, just worth mentioning the renewable heat incentive is a bit of a wrap up. It is coming to an end. Yes, if you are sort of going for a last gasp project, I think I mentioned this last year, March 21 was when it was meant to set to end. It is now going to end in March 2022. So general pool of people will, the scheme will end in March 21. If you've got a tariff guarantee, it will end in March 2022. So a little bit of life left in that. You've got to be fairly quick off the mark now if you're going to get a project up and running, especially a heat pump project. And as I said, follow-on schemes are less attractive. That's the clean heat grant scheme that I was talking about, very small scale grant, £4,000. We're not going to go very much towards a megawatt biomass boiler or a megawatt heat pump, is it? And then, of course, we have the 10-point plan, and this came out on the eve of the Tomato Growers Association conference. This is worth just noting for not the fact that it's got very much in it, but the fact that it doesn't have very much in it. It's lots of words, not actually very much action. It's an aspiration, especially around offshore wind and hydrogen, oddly a bit of nuclear, but generally it's all about words, and quite how making London the centre of green finance is part of a plan to make net zero. I'm not entirely sure, but that's for Boris to answer at some point. But this is, again, just to let you know where the government is heading, and these are the sorts of things that we need to keep an eye on and work out how horticulture fits into them in an aspirational way. So just to sum up then, what does all of this mean? Practical things for horticulture: reduce our consumption, reduce our emissions, look at renewable energy. That's something we've taken up quite a lot over the last 10 years. I'm sure there's more capacity to do that in commercial horticulture. There's a lot more capacity. Reuse our resources. This virtual circle this virtuous circle that people talk about. This is the way that we will all head towards net zero together, if we keep these principles in mind. And as I said, energy and carbon continue to be talked about, and they will carry on moving up the agenda. They will become more and more important. Renewable energy is really becoming quite dominant, especially in the electricity sector. Heat pumps, as I said, keep an eye on that and how that might apply to your business. And ultimately, we're going to need to find, if you need CO2 enrichment, new sources of that, and whether the trade-off from taking it out of the air is that we can actually use it to enrich greenhouse aerial environments. That's a really interesting point to think about. Making first steps, energy efficiency is of renewed importance. And I would say this, I'm dyed-in-the-wool mechanical engineer and come from an energy efficiency background. I'd love to see that make a really big return to importance. And I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jon. Thank you for that. Fascinating as usual. Just one quick question. Biomass, probably 5 years ago, was the watchword. Not mentioned once really in your presentation. And I've got a question: is it renewable?
Yeah, most of the reason for not including biomass is that it's become quite unpopular, and therefore the renewable heat incentive, which really popularised the uptake of biomass, has the tariffs for that have dwindled away, and more people are considering heat pumps than they are biomass boilers. Is it renewable? I would say it is. Ultimately, it is only renewable as long as the carbon that you burn is being soaked up by other biomass out there and becomes more biomass itself. So it is renewable in that sense, and that is a principle in which that biomass is considered a renewable fuel. So you're burning carbon that's been soaked up, and then it is being soaked up again by additional biomass. Of course, in burning biomass, in cutting it down, in transporting it, in chipping it, in processing it, there are carbon emissions associated with that, very low-level carbon emissions, I might add. But we ought to sort of sequester that those carbon emissions as well when we think about burning biomass. Is there a gap before it becomes ready? Yes and no. Yes, clearly, if you burn a tree, then there's got to be a tree of equal magnitude somewhere else to soak up the carbon that tree had in it. However, there's some interesting analysis done regularly on how much biomass is continually being replenished without even thinking about it. Just the general growth of trees and plants and so on means that we are soaking up the carbon that we're burning in effect from biomass.
Thank you very much, John. Obviously, just to remind everyone, and obviously thank Martin as well, but obviously to remind everyone that if they've got questions or would like to further discussion, we'll be running a session on this topic at 3:30. So thank you very much. We'll see you all again in 10 minutes or so. So just time to get up and stretch, perhaps to put the kettle on, and we'll see you again then for the last session, last theme, which is on spring crops. Thank you very much.